In this video, we're looking at 13 different tree ferns, plus 2 epiphytic ferns, as well as tree fern spores and tree fern canopy size. In a previous video, we looked at Dicksonia antarctica in depth, and there's links to that video in the notes below this video. The different ferns time-stamped below the video if you wish to jump to specific ferns. But here we go with Robin from Fern Acres with 13 different tree ferns, an in-depth look. There are lots of different types of tree ferns, not just the Dicksonia antarctica.
Yes. Most people think of the Dicksonia antarctica because that's the one that's prevalent or mostly available when people are looking at tree ferns. All the other varieties are equally as good and have different places in the ecosystem. The first of which would be the Cyathea australis or rough tree fern. This particular tree fern grew from spore here on its own, and it is at the front of the nursery, which in summer will get sun from early in the morning till about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. In nature, the rough tree fern tends to grow higher up the slope, where the Dicksonia tends to be more in the gullies and creekways and lower down the slope, so they have more water supply. The rough tree fern, by nature, has a rough texture to the old frond stems, which is quite coarse, almost like a rasp file. And if you rub your bare skin against it, you'll certainly know about it. The soft tree fern is quite soft and not particularly hazardous unless you've got old frond stems sticking right out. The other unique thing is the coarse hairs or stipes that accumulate in between the old frond stems. This tree fern can take more sun and a little bit less water, and as such it is better for those more open spaces.
But still like a bit of protection from the hot afternoon sun.
It will grow into a full sun position if needed, but it won't grow as thick or as big fronds. We have some that are in front of the house and they don't get shade in summer until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But by the end of summer they look a bit ratty. They have to be trimmed back. And the unique thing about a Cyathea as opposed to a Dicksonia tree fern is that they will have a big spring flush, as you can see in the top of this tree fern at the moment, where it's producing probably 8 to 10 fronds. But unlike the Dicksonia, it will then continue to frond. It constantly puts on growth even during the middle of winter, and therefore has a faster growing rate. The Dicksonia tree ferns, you'll only get about 25 mil of growth height in the trunk per year. With the Cyathea australis, you could get 100 to maybe 150 mil depending on your water supply. The more water you give it and a little bit of protection, the better you will find it will grow. It's quite an amazing tree fern. It tends, this one doesn't because it's clashing with the other one beside it, tends to have a flatter canopy than the Dicksonia, more like an umbrella. And the big advantage of this one is that the old frond stems are self-shedding, and that's all you have to do. You don't have to use clippers. On a Dicksonia, your old frond stems will form a skirt and you will have to cut them off. This is Dicksonia squarrosa, or the Wheki Tree Fern, New Zealand variety. This is a naturally smaller tree fern with a narrow trunk and shorter fronds. The stem is quite very dark brown and is covered with these fine dark brown to rusty brown hairs. This tree fern is suitable to grow in pots or small garden areas. However, like the soft tree fern, it requires plenty of available moisture and shade. Without this, they can get very scorched in the Aussie summer. They're a New Zealand tree fern, as I said, so they're used to, or they've evolved over millions of years in low-lying places adjacent to creeks and waterways, and the Aussie summer is not a favourite for it. But on a protected veranda or in a protected garden spot, they'll do very well with plenty of moisture.
So how old would this one be? This
one is probably about 20 years old.
Okay, and it's about 6 foot 2 metres tall.
Yep. It's looking a bit ratty at the moment in the crown because it's the end of winter and it's waiting for its spring flush of fronds. But normally the fronds are probably half to 2/3 the length of the Dicksonia frond, and they're quite happy to grow for years in a pot where most tree ferns are not suitable for that. This is Cyathea cunninghamii, slender tree fern. It's a native to Australia and New Zealand. Its distribution is not wide as it occurs in isolated pockets due to its exacting requirements. Generally found near water in humus-rich acid soils. It's a slow-growing Cyathea species that requires sun protection. However, I have seen this species growing in Tarabulga National Park on the small banks of small streams, jutting out into the open space above the water. Sun would be limited to only a few hours during the day, but the abundance of moisture and humus material creates some quite spectacular examples of this pretty tree fern. You can see at the base and to about halfway up, it has Microsorum diversifolium, which is the kangaroo fern, and it also has a little bit of Davallia or hare's foot fern growing on it. And this is quite natural for most tree fern species. If they've been around long enough, they will get these sorts of things growing on their trunks. This has grown naturally here. The tree fern was planted about 25 years ago, and again it has a very narrow trunk, as the name implies, slender tree fern, and a small umbrella-like foliage. This is Cyathea dialbata, or sometimes also referred to as Cyathea australis dialbata. It's the silver tree fern, a New Zealand native and their national emblem. It's a large fronded tree fern that looks at first glance a lot like the soft tree fern. The trunk has an abundance of coarse hairs on the trunk and a rougher texture, not as rough as the rough tree fern, but very similar. It has a distinctly silvery hue to the underside and also on the frond stem. The frond stems have the silvery hue, like I said, but it's more pronounced near the base of the stem. This tree fern is amazing, and it grows from situations that are quite dark and protected to slightly more sun exposed and drier. Young plants have a habit of leaning over in the pot or when first planted. Once they are established and they know where they want to be, they'll grow up straight and tall. The two mature examples or semi-mature examples that we have here are of a similar age, but one is quite different from the other. This one that we're showing you now is in a more protected and wetter spot, and you can see the size of the trunk. It's quite thick, quite healthy, and it is probably 2.5 meters or more tall. and it has a very generous canopy. This is the other silver tree fern. Now you can see the width of the trunk is quite narrow. It still has those same coarse hairs. It still has the silvery stems and silvery undertone to the foliage, but the canopy is smaller in diameter, and this is half the height of the other variety. Just like the rough tree fern, this will have a flush of fronds during the spring period, but it will then continue to frond throughout the year. These are the spores, technically speaking, but not accurately speaking. The brown spots you can see are what's called as spore caps, under which the spore is stored. Now, if you wanted to grow from spore, you would need to put this into a paper bag or fold it into a piece of paper while they dried off, and the spore would fall out. Then if you give the paper a little shake, a little jiggle like that, you'll separate the heavier spore caps from the lighter spore. The spore caps are brown. On most ferns, on the vast majority of ferns, the spore will be a bright luminous yellow. Growing spore is a whole different process, and there will, on this small piece section of frond alone, there will be millions of spore. This is Cyathea cooperi, the New South Wales scaly tree fern, or quite often referred to as the coin spot fern. More recently, this has been referred to as the Australian tree fern. This is a misnomer, as yes, it is Australian, occurring from just over the New South Wales border to the top end of Australia. However, the soft tree fern grows from the bottom of Tasmania to subtropical areas of Queensland and across into South Australia, so its distribution is much larger. The Cooperi is a magnificent tree fern that has a very large umbrella canopy of foliage. The trunk is quite distinctive, with scarring from the old frond stems. The old fronds will self-shed like most Cyathea species, which is good as the growth of the tree fern is quite impressive. This example in our nursery is 16 to 17 years old and is obviously beyond the reach of removing the older fronds. Most Cyathea species will self-shed older foliage, while Dicksonias tend to form a skirt of old fronds. This tree fern is not suitable to grow in areas where snow is common, and freezing conditions in winter will kill it very quickly. It is a very large tree fern that will grow in quite exposed areas as long as its root system is somewhat shaded and it has plenty of availability to moisture. It's just one of those ferns, when they're in the pot in the nursery, people pick them up until we show them what they grow into, and then they put them away because they're too large for most suburban backyards unless you have a specific particular interest in this tree fern.
Well, that one's got to be 5 metres tall.
Yeah.
And how many years did you say?
15 to 16 years.
Yeah.
With good water supply, and this one would be bigger, except we're in an alpine area, so we do need to grow it under a tree canopy. But if this were in a more temperate or less temperate climate, it would grow much quicker as well. It likes a little bit of sun exposure, and will grow beautifully with that. But here in King Lake, the winters are too harsh for it, and like most Cyatheas, it's coming into its flush time, so it's putting on 5 or 6 new fronds, which you won't be able to capture on camera, but it will then produce fronds all the year round as well. This is Cyathea medullaris, black tree fern, or mamaku. another New Zealand native. This tree fern's growth habit is similar to the Cyathea Cooperi. It's a quick growing tree fern with a large umbrella type foliage. The stem is covered in coarse black hairs, and the frond midrib is a dark purplish black, which contrasts quite nicely with the green foliage. The emerging new growth has the appearance of a monkey tail due to the coarse hairs covering the crozier, which is the emerging tree fern frond. Young plants like to be protected from too much sun, but the plant is very adaptable once established and will grow quite well with more exposure, provided you give it the moisture that it needs.
So again, I mean, looks even more amazing when it's young, when you can see them. But once they get up there,
yeah. And at this time of year, those croziers, you can literally see them unfolding daily. A couple of days ago, they were just barely visible as almost knuckles in the crown. Now they're a good 12 inches or 30 centimetres out. Tomorrow they'll be probably 40 centimetres out. This particular one is Cyathea brownii, or the Norfolk Island tree fern. It is a relative of Cooperi, Cyathea Cooperi, but being on an isolated island, it has developed slightly differently. The hairs or stipes covering the croziers and the stems are slightly darker than on a Cooperi. Its growth habit is accepted to be slightly more exposed and slightly drier. And like all tree ferns, again, John is showing you the growth of other ferns on the side of the trunk. This particular variety has a self-seeded Dicksonia antarctica growing at its base, but the growth rates are incredibly different to the Norfolk Island tree fern. This is Cyathea smithii. This tree fern has a slightly narrower trunk and is suitable for growing in temperate to subtropical areas. Foliage is dark green with a dark midrib. The old frond stems tend to cling to the trunk, which is unusual for a Cyathea, and give it a stick-like appearance. This fern requires sun protection whilst young, but will grow into a more exposed position once it is established and older.
So this one
is Cyathea howeana, again a relative of the Cooperi, but it's evolved again on an isolated island in its own way. Extraordinarily narrow stem, no hairs on the foliage, produces fronds continuously like every other Cyathea. They are a little bit protected when they're first emerging, but you can see how smooth and shiny this frond stem is, and they don't cause any irritation. It's quite unique. It's not generally available in any massive numbers. They're just produced in small numbers every couple of years. But it's an interesting fern.
And this one's a rare one here?
Yeah, this one is Dicksonia herbertii. Grows along the Herbert River in Queensland and is quite unique to that area. It doesn't really grow anywhere else. It's a slow growing fern. The foliage is exceptionally soft and it has an olivey tan midrib to the foliage, you can see there, and just really pretty little frond. The foliage on this is quite unique in that it is slightly upside down. The midrib and the extending ribs for the foliage are raised above the actual foliage, whereas on most ferns that foliage is above the midrib and extending ribs and you barely see them.
Small example of the Cyathea smithii.
Yep. It's in a 30 centimetre pot. These will grow slightly more exposed once they're established, they'll take an incredible amount of dryness and sunlight, and the new emerging growth is a really lime green as opposed to the older growth, which is a dark green. It has a glossiness to the foliage that a lot of tree ferns don't have, and it has a smaller canopy and a smaller trunk than most standard, what we would call standard tree ferns, so Dicksonia and some of the bigger Cyatheas. This is Cyathea tomentosissima, which is again a relative of the Cooperi. However, it is a dwarf tree fern, growing to a trunk of about 2 meters high. It has very appealing foliage for the fine rusty brown hairs or stipes that are on the stem, and will also appear on the trunk. Unfortunately, we don't have a mature specimen here in the garden because this is a subtropical to tropical species, and we've tried it in the nursery garden and it just doesn't like our cold winters, so we have to protect it from those cold days.
So if you're in a warmer climate, like down off the mountain
in the suburbs of Melbourne and in Melbourne itself, they grow beautifully well, and they will grow out in the garden as long as they're protected from extreme conditions.
And so they'd grow right up the coast, Sydney. Okay, so this would be a good one for the home garden because it's a smaller one.
Well, also this one is quite unique, where most tree ferns you wouldn't even consider to grow them inside. This one you can. You could grow it on a veranda in a pot because it is smaller. It's as I said, a dwarf variety. So it's quite acceptable to grow it in a pot or even indoors. Come out with these bronzy red foliage, but it's too tropical for here.
Right.
We struggle with it, so we've discontinued it. That's the only one we've got left.
So it's Blechnum.
Blechnum brasiliense.
So this is the silver lady?
Yes. The silver lady tree fern is another dwarf and very suitable for growing in a pot indoors or on a veranda or in a small courtyard. Again, like the tomentosissima, it only has a 2 meter trunk. It'll take... Oh, sorry.
It's all right.
Got unclipped. It will take lots of warmth, but it doesn't like direct sun, and it likes to be moist but not overly so. Like all Blechnums, you know you're overwatering when you get these brown or black marks coming up through the foliage. That's a sure sign that you're giving it too much water or there's too much cold. The new growth emerges from the centre like all tree ferns, and it is a much lighter, brighter green than the older fronds, and they tend to have a slightly black, covered in a slightly, not dense, but black stipes on the emerging foliage.
So there's the overwatering sign.
Yeah.
Whereas that bronze on the tip there?
That bronze on the tip is a bit of winter damage from cold nights. Because it is a subtropical to tropical, it's a Pacific Island fern. Our cold nights in winter in King Lake tend to do that sort of damage, but it can be trimmed out without any real issue to the plant, and the emerging growth will just cover it up anyway.
But it's a beautiful little fern.
It is a beautiful little fern. It's very, very popular at the moment to have one of these indoors because they will give you height without needing too big of a pot. This one is about probably roughly 3/4 of a metre high plus the pot, but it gives you form and structure to put in a bathroom or you know, in a corner of the lounge room, and it's just a very soft foliage as well, and it doesn't mind the warmth of heaters going as long as it's not in a direct flow vent. So as long as you keep it away from AC vents and heater vents, it'll grow quite happily in a very warm environment.
And watering for this one?
Well, indoors, you'd be watering it 2 to 3 times a week, depending on your house. Some houses are colder than others. Some houses have more ambient light, so that will be a determining factor. But like all tree ferns, keep them somewhat moist, but don't necessarily leave them sitting in water. This one in particular, being a Blechnum, will tell you by those dark colours coming up through the stem.
So moist but not wet and soggy.
Yep.
And just good filtered light.
Good filtered light, good ambient light. We're in a poly house which has 70% shade cloth, but it's on the sunnier side of the aisle, so it's probably a lot less protected from the light, but it is filtered light all the same.
And fertiliser?
Fertiliser, a weak liquid fertiliser once a month, so half strength sea salt or any of those liquids, or if it's out in the garden, just like we discussed earlier, throw around some dynamic lifter 2 or 3 to 4 times a year and it'll be quite happy. The more light, the bigger the canopy will be, which is somewhat true for all of the Cyathea species, but there are limits. Whereas the Dicksonias, if they've got enough protection from too much direct light, they still need light, but not as much. Their canopies get bigger, being protected from the sun. We've got examples in the nursery where the fronds would only be about a metre, just over a metre long, to examples that are nearly 2.5 metres long.
So even here, the ones that are over at the back, where they're not getting as much
light, are darker
foliage
yep.
than the ones over here,
Yep.
although that's new foliage. And
That's new
and
foliage.
that will darken off,
yes.
yeah. But you can see the ones over at the back are
Quite a bit darker.
So, Slender Lady.
Silver Lady.
Silver Lady. It's a beautiful little tree fern. So with the tree ferns, there's obviously quite a lot of them.
Yes.
And we've looked at a few of them, but there are more?
There are more. There are a lot of tree fern varieties native to Australia and other places in the world like New Zealand or Mexico, South America. These tree ferns have differing requirements, but not necessarily restricting environments. So they can be grown in, some can be grown in pots, some will prefer a garden situation, but there is a tree fern suitable to most situations, whether it be exposed or very shady, drier or quite wet.
So if you're looking for a tree fern, you might be better to go to an experienced grower like Fern Acres.
A specialty grower, yes.
And say, I would like a tree fern for this situation. What's the best one for me?
Yep.
Rather than trying to grow something that is not suited to
Yes.
where you want it.
Most people, when, as I said earlier in the video, most people when they think of tree ferns think of the soft tree fern. Now if you have a more exposed position, they're not going to work that well because they like the shade. Whereas some of the Cyatheas are going to grow exceptionally well, and not all Cyatheas, as we have seen, not all Cyatheas grow as big as the Cooperi or the medullaris or the brownii.
And if you happen to be in North America where you get frosts and freezes, you've got problems.
No, yes you do, because a lot of those tree ferns are not, or our tree ferns are not suitable to North American climates because our winters aren't as intense as North American winters. You can somewhat, if you have the right tree fern, usually the Dicksonia species, protect them by using a hessian bag or a towel or something like that. But ultimately you want to protect it from those harsh winters.
So we hope that this video will help you when you're selecting the right tree fern for your garden. Of course, there are lots of other ferns as well, including low-growing ferns like this one, Dudia aspera. Subscribe to the YouTube channel for regular updates on a whole range of ferns and indeed a whole range of garden plants. And as always, good luck with your gardening.